The dust hung suspended in the late afternoon air of October 18, 1872, as Tombstone, Arizona Territory, witnessed the approach of an unusual caravan. 7 wagons, weathered by the merciless desert sun, creaked along Allen Street, their canvas coverings bleached nearly white against the reddening sky. Local accounts preserved in the Cochise County records describe the caravan as uncommonly quiet for its size, despite the presence of 23 children ranging from 4 to 16 years of age. The leader of this procession was a man who introduced himself as Jeremiah Caldwell, approximately 45 years of age, with a thick beard streaked with premature gray and eyes that, according to Marshal William Breckinridge's subsequent report, never seemed to rest on anything for more than a moment. Caldwell claimed to represent the Western Children's Aid Society of St. Louis, Missouri, an organization purportedly dedicated to relocating orphaned children to suitable homes throughout the expanding Western territories. The remaining adults numbered 7, 3 men who served as drivers and guards, and 4 women who tended to the children. They established camp at the eastern edge of town, near where the Goodenough mine would later be discovered. Local resident Sarah Holbrook, whose property bordered this encampment, noted in her journal that evening, "The children do not play as children ought. They move with uncommon discipline like soldiers awaiting orders. Not one cried, though the youngest cannot be more than 4 years of age." As darkness fell over Tombstone that night, several residents reported hearing singing from the camp, hymns primarily, rendered in children's voices with a precision that some found unsettling. Theodore Jenkins, proprietor of the Tombstone Epitaph, later wrote that the singing carried a melancholy that seemed inappropriate for the young, as if they were performing rather than expressing genuine joy. The following morning, Caldwell visited Mayor John Clum's office, presenting documentation that appeared to authorize the society to transport these children west for placement, with families seeking adopted labor and companionship. The papers bore signatures from officials in Missouri and Kansas, though later investigation would reveal concerning irregularities in these documents. Most troubling was the Register of Children, which listed 23 names but provided minimal information about their origins. The only consistent detail was that each child had supposedly been orphaned during the recent turbulence following the Civil War, or by various outbreaks of disease that had swept through the poorer quarters of St. Louis and Kansas City. Mayor Clum, though initially suspicious, granted permission for the caravan to remain in Tombstone for up to 2 weeks, while Caldwell arranged placements for the children. This decision would later haunt him profoundly. In his personal correspondence discovered decades later, Clum confessed, "I saw uncertainty in those children's eyes, yet I allowed bureaucracy to overcome basic human intuition. Their silence should have spoken volumes." That afternoon, Caldwell and his associates began presenting the children to prospective families in Tombstone. Witnesses described the process as remarkably transactional, with Caldwell emphasizing the children's capacity for work rather than their need for care. He requested donations to the society, ranging from $15 to $40 per child, depending on the child's age, gender, and apparent strength, a practice that, while not technically illegal at the time, certainly existed in an ethical gray area that would soon darken considerably. The children themselves were remembered for their unusual composure. Eleanor Duffield, who considered adopting a 12-year-old girl named Mary, recalled, "The child answered questions politely but offered nothing more. When asked about her parents or her journey, she would look to Mr. Caldwell before responding with carefully chosen words that revealed nothing of substance. Her eyes, however, seemed to communicate something altogether different from her practiced responses." By sunset of that first full day in Tombstone, 3 children had been placed with local families, 2 boys taken by a rancher named Samuel Greer, who needed help with his expanding cattle operation, and a 14-year-old girl placed with the Wilkerson family to assist with their boarding house. None of these placements involved formal adoption procedures, merely the exchange of money and a crudely written receipt. That night, several residents living near the encampment reported unusual activity, lanterns moving between wagons long after reasonable hours, hushed but intense conversations among the adult supervisors, and at one point, what sounded like muffled crying quickly silenced. Deputy Sheriff Thomas Morris, passing by on his nightly rounds, paused to observe, but, finding nothing overtly suspicious, continued on his way, a decision that would later be scrutinized during the subsequent investigation. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. If you value historical stories that reveal the darker, often forgotten chapters of American history, subscribe now to ensure you never miss these vital chronicles that remind us of our shared past and the lessons we must never forget. As dawn broke over Tombstone on October 20th, 1872, the Wilkerson family made a disturbing discovery. The girl placed in their care, 14-year-old Catherine, according to the ledger, had vanished during the night. More concerning than her absence were the conditions of her departure. Her few belongings remained untouched. Her bed showed signs of having been slept in, and the back door of the boarding house stood slightly ajar, though Mrs. Wilkerson insisted she had secured it before retiring. When confronted with the girl's disappearance, Jeremiah Caldwell expressed concern that appeared genuine to many observers. He suggested that Catherine, like many of the children in his care, had a history of flight and wandering due to the traumas she had endured. He promised to search for her and proposed that the society would provide a different child to the Wilkersons as a replacement, a suggestion that Martha Wilkerson later described as oddly transactional, as if we were discussing damaged merchandise rather than a lost child. By midday, a second development heightened tensions. Samuel Greer rode into town reporting that one of the two boys placed with him had also disappeared. The remaining boy, when questioned, maintained that he had been asleep and noticed nothing unusual, though Greer noted that the child appeared unusually fearful when asked about his companion's whereabouts. Marshal Breckinridge began making inquiries about the missing children, but found himself stymied by a peculiar lack of useful information. None of the townspeople had seen the children after dark. No tracks were discovered leading from either property, and the remaining children at the encampment professed no knowledge of any planned departures or escapes. Caldwell offered his full cooperation with the investigation, even allowing Breckinridge to interview the remaining children in his care. These interviews yielded little of substance. Each child gave nearly identical answers about their backgrounds and journey, reciting their histories as if reading from an invisible script. When pressed on contradictions or asked for specific details, they would grow silent or defer to Caldwell for permission to continue. One observer presented these interviews, schoolteacher Harriet Palmer, later wrote to her sister in Boston, "The children speak as if their very thoughts are being monitored. Their eyes constantly seek permission before their lips form words. I have taught children for 20 years and have never witnessed such uniform constraint of natural childish expression." Despite growing unease, no legal grounds existed to detain Caldwell or his caravan. The documentation he carried, though sparse by modern standards, satisfied the minimal requirements of the era. Additionally, the territorial government had limited resources to investigate what could still be explained as runaways rather than foul play. That evening, a meeting was held at the Tombstone courthouse, where concerned citizens debated how to proceed. Samuel Greer argued forcefully for detaining Caldwell and his associates until the missing children were located. Others, including Mayor Clum, advocated caution, noting the lack of concrete evidence suggesting criminal activity. The debate grew heated but produced no decisive action, a paralysis that several participants would later recall with profound regret. Meanwhile, activity at the Caravan encampment had changed subtly but significantly. The women who had previously tended to the children now kept them entirely confined to the wagons. The men had begun standing watch in shifts throughout the night. A local boy who attempted to approach the camp to speak with one of the children was firmly but politely redirected away by one of Caldwell's associates, who explained they were under quarantine precautions due to concerns about potential illness. This claim of possible disease spread rapidly through Tombstone, creating an effective buffer around the encampment. Few residents were willing to risk exposure, particularly given the town's limited medical resources and recent memories of devastating epidemics that had swept through other frontier communities. By the morning of October 21st, the situation had deteriorated further. The Wilkerson family reported that someone had attempted to enter their boarding house during the night, but fled when Mr. Wilkerson investigated the noise. More disturbing was the discovery that the remaining boy placed with Samuel Greer had also vanished, this time with clear signs of struggle in his sleeping quarters. Marshal Breckinridge, now convinced that something nefarious was occurring, assembled a small group of deputies to place the caravan encampment under surveillance. Their observations revealed an encampment preparing for imminent departure, despite Caldwell's assurances to Mayor Clum that they intended to remain for the full 2-week period initially discussed. As tension mounted, a new witness came forward. Eleanor Duffield, who had considered adopting 12-year-old Mary, approached Marshal Breckenridge with information she had initially dismissed as childish imagination. During her interview with the girl, Mary had briefly whispered when Caldwell was momentarily distracted that the names they gave us aren't our real names, and that we're not allowed to say where we really come from. Before Duffield could question the child further, Caldwell had returned, and Mary immediately resumed her rehearsed responses. Duffield had not reported this exchange initially, believing it might simply reflect the confusion of an orphaned child. Now, with children missing, the interaction took on darker significance. By sunset on October 21st, Marshal Breckenridge had gathered enough concerning evidence to justify more direct intervention. He planned to visit the encampment at first light, with a formal warrant to inspect all wagons and interview each child individually, away from Caldwell's influence. The warrant, signed by Judge Wells Spicer after reviewing Breckenridge's evidence, would also temporarily prevent the caravan from leaving Tombstone pending a more thorough investigation. This plan, however sound, came too late. In the early hours of October 22, 1872, while Tombstone slept under an unseasonably cold desert sky, the caravan made its move. A thin crescent moon provided just enough light for Caldwell and his associates to break camp with practiced efficiency. By 3 o'clock in the morning, all 7 wagons were moving silently west along the Tucson Road, their departure noticed only by insomniac prospector Elijah Monroe, who observed from the window of his small cabin on the outskirts of town. Monroe, assuming the caravan had legitimate business requiring an early departure, took no immediate action. It wasn't until Marshal Breckenridge arrived at the abandoned campsite shortly after dawn, warrant in hand, that the alarm was raised. By then, the caravan had gained a significant head start, approximately 4 hours according to Monroe's recollection. What followed was a hastily organized pursuit. Breckenridge deputized 6 men, including Samuel Greer and Theodore Jenkins from the Epitaph, who insisted on documenting what many now believed was a criminal flight. The terrain west of Tombstone presented brutal challenges for pursuers, rough, largely unmapped, and with few reliable water sources. The caravan, despite its cumbersome wagons, had selected its escape route strategically. Leave a comment if you've ever wondered about the lost stories of America's frontier children. What other untold tragedies might have occurred as vulnerable young people were moved across the expanding nation? Your insights help us understand the emotional impact of this history. The trail remained clear for approximately 17 miles, before splitting at a rock formation locals called Prayer's End. Here, the caravan had divided, 4 wagons continuing northwest toward the Colorado River, while 3 turned south in the direction of the Mexican border. Breckenridge faced an impossible choice that would haunt the investigation: which group to pursue. After brief deliberation, he split his posse as well, taking 4 men northwest while sending Greer and Jenkins south with instructions to track but not engage until reinforcements could be summoned from Fort Huachuca. This division of forces, while logical, effectively weakened both pursuit parties and may have played directly into Caldwell's strategy. Breckenridge's group followed the Northwest Trail for another 23 miles before losing it completely in the rocky terrain near what is now Cochran, Arizona. Despite an exhaustive search covering nearly 40 square miles over the next 2 days, no further sign of the wagons was discovered. Greer and Jenkins fared little better. They tracked the southern wagons to within 8 miles of the Mexican border before finding the vehicles abandoned in a shallow ravine. The wagons contained only supplies, no personal belongings, no documentation, and most significantly, no sign of any children. Hoof prints suggested that the group had transferred to horseback, likely using mounts kept ready at this predetermined location, and continued south across the border where territorial authorities had no jurisdiction. When the pursuers returned to Tombstone on October 25th, public outrage reached a fever pitch. 20 children had effectively vanished while under the town's nominal protection. The 3 children initially placed with families, now all missing, were the only ones whose names and descriptions had been recorded by anyone outside Caldwell's organization. For the remaining 20, authorities had only the dubious ledger Caldwell had presented, which subsequent investigation suggested contained fabricated identities. In the aftermath, Marshal Breckinridge sent telegrams to authorities throughout the Southwest and into Mexico, providing what limited descriptions they had of Caldwell and his associates. These efforts generated occasional reports of similar operations in other territories, but produced no concrete leads on the Tombstone Caravan's whereabouts. Most disturbing was the discovery made by Theodore Jenkins, who, through journalistic contacts, confirmed that no Western Children's Aid Society existed in St. Louis or anywhere else in Missouri. The organization's letterhead, which had appeared superficially legitimate to Mayor Klum, was an elaborate fabrication. Further investigation into Caldwell's documentation revealed that the signatures of Missouri and Kansas officials had been forged, skillfully enough to pass casual inspection but clearly fraudulent under closer scrutiny. The territorial governor, upon reviewing copies of these documents, noted that several purported signatories had either died or left office before the dates on the papers. Local speculation about the children's fate ran rampant, with theories ranging from forced labor in mines or agricultural operations to more sinister outcomes that the epitaph deemed too disturbing to print. Whatever the truth, the reality remained that 23 children had arrived in Tombstone, and none remained. The abandoned wagons yielded few clues beyond confirming the deception's scope. Hidden compartments contained additional forged documents, suggesting the group operated across multiple territories under various organizational names. A partially burned ledger recovered from the ashes of a campfire indicated financial transactions, children identified only by initials and numbers, with corresponding monetary amounts that increased and decreased in patterns, suggesting an accounting of costs and profits. Most haunting was a small leather-bound book discovered wedged beneath a wagon seat, a diary belonging to one of the female attendants. The final entry, dated October 21st, contained a cryptic passage. Jay says movement tonight. The Sonora operation awaits. God forgive me, but I cannot bear to watch another transfer. These children deserve better than to become ledger entries. The diary's earlier pages had been torn out, leaving investigators with this single ambiguous clue about the caravan's ultimate destination and the writer's apparent moral conflict. The reference to Sonora suggested the group was indeed headed for Mexico, but the vast Sonoran territory provided countless places where people, especially children who might not be missed, could disappear. By month's end, the search had officially been scaled back, though Marshal Breckinridge continued sending inquiries for years afterward. The case transformed him, colleagues noted, from an efficient but detached lawman into someone obsessively dedicated to resolving this single failure of justice. His personal journal, discovered after his death in 1899, revealed that he had used much of his own salary to fund continued investigation long after official resources were redirected elsewhere. By November 1872, what locals had begun calling the Children's Caravan case had expanded beyond Tombstone's capabilities. Territorial Governor Anson P.K. Safford, responding to increasingly sensational newspaper coverage, authorized a more comprehensive investigation, led by Special Investigator Hammond Prescott, formerly of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Prescott arrived in Tombstone on November 7th, bringing with him a methodical approach and resources that the local authorities lacked. His first action was to compile comprehensive physical descriptions of Caldwell and his 7 associates, based on interviews with everyone who had interacted with the caravan. These descriptions were circulated throughout the Western Territories, northern Mexico, and as far east as St. Louis. This effort quickly yielded the investigation's first significant break. A sheriff in Yuma recognized one of the female attendants, identified as Miss Abigail Winters in Tombstone, as a woman who had been briefly detained in his jurisdiction the previous year under the name Sarah Hollister. She had been questioned in connection with a suspiciously similar operation involving the transportation of orphaned children, but released due to insufficient evidence of wrongdoing. More disturbing was correspondence from authorities in Santa Fe, who reported that a man matching Jeremiah Caldwell's description had presented himself there in early 1871 as Reverend Thomas Blackwood of the Eastern Orphan Relief Association. He had left Santa Fe with 11 children and authorization to collect more from outlying settlements. No subsequent record existed confirming the children's placement with families. Prescott's investigation revealed a pattern spanning at least 5 years and multiple territories. The operation appeared to function by targeting remote or recently established communities where documentation requirements were minimal and local authorities were overwhelmed with other concerns. In each location, the pattern was nearly identical: arrival with children, collection of more from local sources when possible, placement of a few with families to establish legitimacy, and then disappearance. The most revealing evidence came from Denver, where a man believed to be Caldwell had been operating as Dr. Frederick Latimer in 1869. He had fled when authorities began questioning the legitimacy of his medical credentials, but not before an assistant, arrested while attempting to follow him, provided limited testimony in exchange for reduced charges. This testimony suggested connections to an organized network extending into Mexico and possibly as far south as Guatemala, dealing in what the Denver courts delicately termed human resources, but what modern terminology would unambiguously identify as human trafficking. By December, Prescott had assembled enough information to develop a theory about the caravan's true purpose. In his confidential report to Governor Safford, preserved in the territorial archives, he wrote, "The evidence suggests we are witnessing a sophisticated operation for the acquisition and distribution of child labor and potentially worse forms of exploitation, operating across territorial boundaries to evade jurisdiction. The children are likely being transported to locations where labor laws are non-existent or unenforced, primarily mining operations, agricultural concerns, and domestic service in regions of Mexico where American authorities cannot reach." Prescott's investigation also shed light on the likely origins of the children themselves. While Caldwell had claimed they were orphans from Missouri and Kansas, evidence suggested many had actually been collected from vulnerable populations throughout the territories: children of deceased miners, impoverished immigrant families, Native American communities disrupted by conflict or relocation, and in some cases, simply abducted from remote homesteads where disappearances might be attributed to accident or animal attack. The diary fragment recovered from the abandoned wagon proved particularly valuable when Prescott connected it to similar handwriting on documents found in Denver. He identified the likely author as Margaret Shelby, a woman who had worked as a nurse in St. Louis before disappearing in 1868. Her reference to another transfer and the Sonora operation aligned with intelligence from Mexican authorities about agricultural operations in Sonora State that employed suspicious numbers of foreign children. In January 1873, Prescott's investigation led him across the border into Mexico, where he worked with local authorities sympathetic to his cause. Here, the trail both clarified and complicated. Several haciendas and mines in northern Sonora were indeed employing children matching the general descriptions of those missing from Tombstone, but proving they were the same children proved nearly impossible. Few records had been kept, and those that existed used Spanish names that bore no resemblance to those in Caldwell's ledger. Furthermore, the operations themselves, while morally reprehensible by modern standards, existed in a legal gray area in 1873 Mexico. Child labor was common and largely unregulated, particularly in remote areas. Without specific evidence connecting these children to kidnapping rather than legitimate employment arrangements, Mexican authorities had limited grounds for intervention. The most concrete lead emerged in late January when Prescott located a mining operation near Cananea, where at least 7 children matching the general age and description of those from the Tombstone Caravan were working in conditions he described as approaching slavery in all but name. When he attempted to interview these children, however, he was denied access by armed guards. By the time he returned with Mexican officials, the children had been moved. One local worker, speaking on condition of anonymity, claimed that Los Niños del Norte, the children from the north, were frequently transferred between operations whenever authorities showed interest. This suggested an extensive network with advance warning systems that could rapidly relocate the children beyond the reach of investigation. In Tombstone, public interest in the case began to wane as weeks stretched into months without resolution. Mayor Klum, whose initial approval had allowed the caravan to operate in town, faced significant criticism. In a public letter published in the Epitaph, he acknowledged his responsibility. "I failed to recognize predators disguised as benefactors, and children have suffered for this failure of judgment. I can offer no excuse that would mitigate this fundamental breakdown of the protection we owe to the most vulnerable among us." By spring 1873, Prescott's official investigation was wound down due to jurisdictional limitations and resource constraints. His final report to Governor Safford concluded that while the operation had almost certainly been transporting children for exploitative labor, the trail had effectively gone cold. "The children of the Tombstone Caravan," he wrote, "had likely been absorbed into a system designed to obscure identities and origins, a system operating in regions where American law cannot reach and local law chooses not to." Despite the official closure, several individuals continued pursuing the case privately. Marshal Breckinridge maintained correspondence with authorities across the border for years. Theodore Jenkins used his position at the Epitaph to publish periodic updates on similar operations, hoping to prevent future incidents. And in Mexico, a Catholic priest named Father Miguel Dominguez, moved by Prescott's account, began his own quiet investigation into the haciendas and mines employing foreign children. These continued efforts would eventually yield results, though not the resolution for which Tombstone had hoped. 5 years passed before the Tombstone Caravan case resurfaced in public consciousness. In March 1878, Father Miguel Dominguez crossed into Arizona territory, carrying documentation that would breathe new life into the dormant investigation. His arrival in Tombstone created a sensation, particularly when Marshal Breckinridge, still serving in his position, called an emergency town meeting to hear the priest's testimony. Dominguez, who had spent the intervening years building trust within communities throughout Sonora, had methodically documented the presence of American and European children in various labor operations. Most significantly, he had managed to record testimonies from 17 children who described experiences matching the Tombstone Caravan's operations, though most had been too young at the time of their acquisition to provide specific details about their origins. His most valuable contribution was a ledger confiscated from an administrative building at the La Esperanza silver mine near Arizpe. This document, which Dominguez had obtained through means he tactfully described as outside normal channels, contained entries corresponding to children received from northern providers between 1869 and 1875. While the ledger used code names rather than identifying specific sources, several entries from October 1872 referenced a delivery from Caravan that included 20 units, ages 4 to 16. Jeremiah Caldwell had been identified by multiple witnesses as using the alias Calvin Moore in other territories, making Caravan a plausible codename. The number, age range, and date aligned precisely with the Tombstone Caravan's missing children. The ledger detailed how these children had been dispersed throughout the region, some to mining operations, others to large agricultural estates, and a disturbing number to what were described as domestic placements in urban centers as far south as Mexico City. Each entry included a monetary value assigned to the child based on age, gender, physical condition, and anticipated service duration. Father Dominguez also brought hope in the form of verified information about 3 children he believed had been part of the Tombstone group. 2 boys, now teenagers working at La Esperanza, had distinct recollections of being transported through a desert town where the buildings had funny names about death and graves. More compelling was the testimony of a 16-year-old girl working as a domestic servant in Hermosillo, who specifically remembered being presented to families in a wooden room with a star on the wall, a description matching the Tombstone courthouse, where Caldwell had conducted some of his interviews with prospective adopters. Breckinridge, reinvigorated by this new evidence, immediately telegraphed Hammond Prescott, who was by then working for the territorial government in Phoenix. Within a week, Prescott had secured authorization for a new investigation, this time with international cooperation formally requested through diplomatic channels, rather than the informal arrangements that had limited his previous efforts. The renewed investigation benefited from changing attitudes on both sides of the border. Child labor practices were facing increasing scrutiny, and several Mexican officials were eager to address operations that had previously been ignored. American diplomatic pressure, backed by Father Dominguez's detailed evidence, secured unprecedented cooperation from Mexican authorities. In April 1878, a coordinated operation involving lawmen from both nations raided the La Esperanza mine and 3 associated properties. They found conditions that horrified even the most hardened officials. Children as young as 9, working 12-hour shifts in dangerous underground operations, housed in deplorable conditions, and subjected to physical punishment for failing to meet extraction quotas. Many showed signs of chronic malnutrition and injuries that had healed without proper medical attention. Among the rescued children were 5 positively identified as part of the Tombstone Caravan, identified through a combination of physical descriptions, birthmarks noted in Caldwell's ledger. Ironically, his detailed inventory of the children he trafficked now served to rescue them, and their own fragmentary memories of the journey. The operation's administrators were arrested, but the highest levels of the organization remained elusive. Evidence suggested Caldwell had moved on to other territories or perhaps even returned east under a new identity. Documents recovered during the raids indicated the operation had grown more sophisticated, using multiple layers of intermediaries to distance the principal organizers from the actual acquisition and transportation of children. Throughout the summer and fall of 1878, similar raids on properties identified in the La Esperanza ledger led to the recovery of 12 more children believed to be from the Tombstone Caravan. The youngest had only vague recollections of their early lives, while the older ones had often suppressed their memories as a survival mechanism. All showed signs of having been systematically conditioned to forget their origins, punished for speaking English or mentioning their lives before Mexico, rewarded for adopting new identities and histories. The returning children presented authorities with a complex humanitarian challenge. 6 years had passed since their disappearance. The youngest had spent more than half their lives in Mexico and spoke primarily Spanish. Some had developed protective psychological bonds with their captors or fellow victims. All required specialized care that the frontier territories were ill-equipped to provide. In November 1878, Theodore Jenkins published a landmark series of articles in the Epitaph documenting the children's recovery and the challenges of their reintegration. His compassionate but unflinching reporting helped catalyze support for establishing a specialized facility in Tucson, dedicated to the rehabilitation of these and other traumatized children, one of the earliest such institutions in the American West. Justice, however, remained elusive. While Mexican authorities prosecuted several mine and hacienda operators for their treatment of the children, the architects of the trafficking operation itself largely escaped legal consequences. Jeremiah Caldwell was never apprehended. Credible reports placed him in various locations, operating similar schemes in the Washington Territory in 1877, boarding a ship for Europe in 1879, even running a supposedly legitimate orphanage in Philadelphia under yet another alias in the early 1880s, but he was never definitively located. Of the 23 children who had arrived in Tombstone in that fateful caravan, 17 were eventually accounted for. The 17 recovered during the 1878 operations. The fate of the remaining 6 became the subject of rumor and speculation. Some evidence suggested they had been transported to even more remote locations in Central America. Other reports indicated that at least 2 had died during the initial journey into Mexico or from subsequent mistreatment. Perhaps the most significant outcome of the case was its influence on legislation. Theodore Jenkins's articles were reprinted in newspapers throughout the country, generating public outrage that translated into political pressure. In 1883, Arizona Territory enacted some of the nation's most stringent laws governing the transportation and placement of children, requiring detailed documentation and oversight that would have immediately flagged Caldwell's operation as suspicious. Other territories and states soon followed, creating a patchwork of protections that, while imperfect, made large-scale child trafficking operations significantly more difficult to conduct. These early regulations formed the foundation for more comprehensive federal legislation enacted in the early 20th century. For Tombstone itself, the Caravan incident left an indelible mark on the community's consciousness. The town's famous reputation for lawlessness and violence often overshadows this tragedy in popular history, but local memory preserved it. For decades afterward, residents maintained a tradition of leaving small personal items, toys, books, articles of clothing, at the site where the caravan had camped, a memorial to children whose names many could no longer recall, but whose fate had briefly united an otherwise fractious frontier community in shared outrage and remorse. By the dawn of the 20th century, The story of the Tombstone Caravan had faded from national consciousness, overshadowed by the town's more sensationalized history of mining booms and gunfights. Yet in archives, personal journals, and the oral histories of certain families, the case maintained a persistent, haunting presence, a wound in the community's history that never properly healed. The final chapter of this tragedy emerged gradually through the efforts of historian Elizabeth Montgomery, who in 1922 began collecting testimonies from elderly residents who remembered the incident. Her work, eventually published as The Children's Caravan, a forgotten tragedy of the American frontier, brought to light the long-term consequences of those 7 fateful days in 1872. Montgomery's research revealed that Marshal William Breckinridge had continued his investigation privately long after official efforts ceased, dedicating his personal resources to tracking Jeremiah Caldwell's operations across multiple states and territories. Correspondence found among Breckinridge's effects after his death indicated he had traced Caldwell to at least 14 different locations, operating under at least 9 distinct aliases between 1872 and 1889. The most significant discovery came from Breckinridge's final journal, where he documented locating Caldwell, then using the name Edwin Thornton, in Denver in 1888. Confronting the man privately, Breckinridge had demanded information about the still missing 6 children from the Tombstone Caravan. According to the journal, Caldwell had responded with chilling indifference. "Some merchandise is lost in every venture. The market absorbs such costs." Breckinridge, operating outside his jurisdiction and without legal authority, had apparently contemplated taking justice into his own hands, but ultimately chose to alert local authorities. By the time Denver police arrived to investigate, Caldwell had disappeared again, leaving behind only a hastily abandoned hotel room. This would be the last confirmed sighting of the man responsible for the Tombstone tragedy. Montgomery also documented the aftermath for the 17 children recovered during the 1878 operations. Their stories reflected the complex, often heartbreaking challenges of reintegration after prolonged trauma and cultural displacement. Some had been successfully reunited with extended family members who had never stopped searching for them. Others, with no remaining family connections, had been placed in institutions or adopted by families throughout the territory. The outcomes varied dramatically. Several survivors had managed to build relatively stable lives despite their experiences, while others struggled with what modern psychology would recognize as severe trauma responses. Alcoholism, recurring nightmares, difficulty maintaining relationships, and periodic dissociative episodes were commonly reported. 2 had died by suicide before the age of 30, leaving letters that directly referenced their early experiences. Perhaps most poignant were the accounts of survivors who had maintained connections with each other, forming a surrogate family bonded by shared trauma. 4 of the recovered children had eventually settled within 50 miles of each other in Southern California, creating a small community that met regularly until the early 1920s. They referred to themselves, according to one member's daughter, as Los Sobrevivientes del Caravan, the survivors of the caravan. Montgomery's research also uncovered evidence suggesting that the Tombstone operation had been part of a much larger network than previously understood. Documents from federal investigations conducted in the 1890s indicated connections to similar operations in at least 12 states and territories, with international extensions into Mexico, Guatemala, and possibly as far as Peru and Brazil. Collectively, these operations may have trafficked thousands of children over nearly 3 decades. The architect behind this network remained elusive. While Jeremiah Caldwell Edwin Thornton appeared to have been a significant operator, evidence suggested he answered to higher authorities, possibly legitimate businessmen whose investments in mining, agriculture, and manufacturing created demand for cheap, easily controlled labor. These connections, however, were never conclusively proven, protected by layers of intermediaries and the passage of time. Most disturbing was Montgomery's discovery regarding the 6 children never accounted for from the Tombstone Caravan. Through correspondence with a former administrator at the La Esperanza mine who had turned state's evidence during the 1878 prosecutions, she learned of a separate operation that took the most promising children from various trafficking networks and diverted them to specialized locations. These children, selected for intelligence, appearance, or other desirable characteristics, were reportedly placed in household service with wealthy families throughout the Americas, their origins completely obscured. According to this source, at least 4 of Tombstone's missing 6 had been diverted into this elite trafficking channel, effectively disappearing not into the relatively documented world of industrial labor, but into private households where their presence might never generate records. The remaining 2, he claimed, had died during transportation, one from illness exacerbated by desert conditions, another from injuries sustained during an escape attempt. Montgomery's work provided vital historical documentation, but little concrete justice. By the time her research was published in 1925, most of the principal figures in the case had died. Jeremiah Caldwell's ultimate fate remained unknown. No death record for any of his known aliases was ever discovered, leading some to speculate that he may have successfully established a new identity, or even returned to Europe where the demand for his particular skills might have continued unabated. The broader legacy of the case manifested in legislative reform. The publicity generated by Montgomery's book contributed to the passage of additional federal protections for children in the 1920s and 1930s. The case was explicitly cited during congressional hearings that led to expanded regulations governing interstate transportation of minors and enhanced requirements for documentation in child placement proceedings. For the town of Tombstone itself, the Caravan incident represented a complex moral legacy. As the community transitioned from frontier settlement to tourist destination trading on its Wild West history, the children's tragedy was increasingly omitted from official narratives. It lacked the romanticized drama of mining adventures or shootouts at the OK Corral. It offered no heroes, only victims and collective failure. Nevertheless, certain traditions persisted. The small memorial at the Caravan's campsite, maintained informally for decades, was finally formalized in 1947 with a simple stone marker bearing the inscription, "In memory of 23 children who arrived on October 18, 1872, and were failed by this community. May we never again mistake silence for peace or paperwork for protection." Annual ceremonies at this memorial, typically attended by only a handful of residents, continued well into the 1960s before gradually fading as the last people with direct connections to the events passed away. The site itself was eventually absorbed by expanding development, the marker relocated to the Tombstone Courthouse Museum, where it receives far less attention than exhibits related to the town's more famous historical events. The most enduring legacy may be the least visible: the descendants of the recovered children, now dispersed throughout the country, many unaware of their connection to this historical tragedy. Genealogical research conducted in the early 2000s identified over 200 living individuals directly descended from survivors of the Tombstone Caravan. When contacted by researchers, many expressed surprise at learning this aspect of their family history, often noting that their parents or grandparents had been reluctant to discuss their early childhoods. One descendant, interviewed for a historical journal in 2012, observed, "My grandmother would never talk about her life before age 12. She changed the subject whenever it came up. But she was obsessive about keeping track of us children, knowing exactly where we were at all times. And she kept a packed suitcase in her closet her entire life, even when she was in her 90s in a nursing home. Now I understand why." The story of Tombstone's missing children illustrates how vulnerable populations have often been erased from frontier narratives. In the expansion of America westward, certain losses were deemed acceptable, collateral damage in the nation's march toward its perceived destiny. Native children forcibly removed from their communities, immigrant children separated from their families, orphan children transported as commodities. These stories complicate the triumphant narrative of Western settlement. The caravan that arrived in Tombstone with 23 children and departed without a single one represents more than an isolated tragedy. It stands as testament to systems of exploitation that flourished in regulatory gaps and jurisdictional boundaries, to moral failures that occur when bureaucracy overrides basic human intuition, and to the courage of individuals who continue seeking justice long after official interest has waned. If you've watched this far, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and please like and share this video with anyone interested in the overlooked chapters of American history. Your support helps ensure these important stories aren't forgotten. In Tombstone today, tourists still flock to the reenactments of famous gunfights and the graves of notorious outlaws. Few visit the small marker commemorating 23 children whose names have largely been forgotten. Yet their story remains essential. A reminder that history's truest measure lies not in what a society celebrates, but in what it fails to protect.